not the mother of your children.
Don't bring the boys into this.
All right. Not the woman you married!
I refuse to be blamed any longer for this grotesque misalliance!
Alright, so a lot of the commentary on The Crown focuses on how it misrepresents reality and how misrepresenting reality is problematic, and that's a worthy critique. That's an important conversation. But when I was watching season 5, I felt like something else was wrong, something big was missing. So I went back and rewatched the earlier seasons, focusing on each episode purely as fiction, because I wanted to answer a pretty simple question. What's the point of this show? Well, at its best, you can watch and have absolutely no idea that it's based on true series of events, that these people actually lived, and it still makes for good television because it tells stories. This video is going to look at how exactly it does that, how The Crown uses well-established storytelling tools, such as the hero's journey, to communicate far more than strict adherence to literal truth could. Or at least it used to. The Crown is a historical drama series starting in 1947 and with the latest season 5 drop working through to 1997. The setup follows Elizabeth II as queen, managing a parade of prime ministers, domestic issues, foreign relations, and her interpersonal relationships with her husband Prince Philip and sister Princess Margaret, and eventually her children, including Prince Charles and his wife, Princess Diana. Each season functions rather like a united collection of one-act plays with sporadic focus on side characters or certain political events, and famously, the entire cast is refreshed every 2 seasons to reflect the passing of time. The show has been consistently praised for high-quality acting, cinematography, and production value overall. But beyond those metrics, the first 4 seasons are remarkable when it comes to storytelling. I mean, damn it, this show made me actually feel bad for Prince Charles, made me feel connected to Prince Philip, made me root for Queen Elizabeth, people who in real life represent an establishment that I politically detest, but as characters on screen were eminently moving. Now, I'm saying were here because I think from a storytelling perspective, season 5 was a huge letdown. And to be clear, I don't think seasons 1 through 4 are absolutely flawless. The show's build of presenting major historical events as direct results of interpersonal drama amongst royals often goes too far, and sometimes reaches the point of insulting to, sure, the royals, but whatever, namely to the protagonists of the stories that are relegated to being backdrops to, like, Elizabeth's personal development. But again, as pure fiction, there's nothing really wrong with that. It's only when considered in relation to reality that a moral obligation emerges in storytelling. Though even just as fiction, it's bewildering and frustrating when fascinating narratives like Kwame Nkrumah's presidency are flattened to make space for invented narratives. But let's go ahead and look at what storytelling mechanisms The Crown uses to heighten reality into fiction, to create strong narratives in a way that represents undercurrent truths of life rather than aesthetic replication of lives. In this sense, the premise of the show is both true and artificial. Surface-level truths are discarded or altered so that underlying truths can be felt through the screen. And I don't necessarily mean underlying truths about monarchy or the royal family, but simply about being human. In the best episodes, it's not just that these people are humanized, but that they're the couriers of human truths. Whether it's existential loneliness or spiritual hunger or wondering what your life would look like if just one thing were different. So The Crown doesn't make stuff up for the heck of it, but rather uses common tropes of storytelling to heighten an already interesting reality into compelling story. It's certainly interesting that a privileged boy from England holds the title Prince of Wales, but watching the literal run-up to the ceremony scene by scene wouldn't be all that interesting, so how do they make it compelling? They use the hero's journey. So we'll start there, then look at character archetypes, the trope of self versus shadow, and symbolism before turning to season 5, where I'm unable to answer the question of why should anyone watch. So, the hero's journey, based on the seminal works of Joseph Campbell, is basically the idea that in stories all across the world, throughout all eras and cultures, there is a recurring pattern of storytelling that revolves around a hero moving from the ordinary world to a special world and then back to ordinary. Campbell's journey had 17 stages, but more commonly used is the simplified 12-stage journey, best explained by script consultant Christopher Vogler. So these are the 12 steps, and we're about to walk through them in season 3 of The Crown. This pattern does seem to emerge incidentally, but it also provides handy intentional scaffolding for writers. You can plot out these 12 steps, send your hero through them, and you'll usually have at least a halfway decent story. The very best writers use it too. Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Jane Eyre, Cinderella, absolute classics that are dramatically different from one another, but they all use similar structure to launch their story. It's not the be-all end-all of storytelling by any means, but particularly in a show like The Crown, it's a smart way to build a narrative out of a real-life event. The best example of the hero's journey in The Crown is one of the highest rated episodes, big fan favorite and winner of multiple awards, Season 3, Episode 6, Tywysog Cymru. The episode focuses on Charles in the run-up to his investiture as Prince of Wales. We see Charles in England studying at the University of Cambridge. Back in London, Prime Minister Harold Wilson suggests to Queen Elizabeth that Charles be sent to Wales to learn Welsh for his ceremonial speech at the upcoming investiture as Prince of Wales. His tutor, Edward Millward, is a devout Welsh nationalist, but like Charles, acts out of duty, and the two grow to respect and understand each other. It's an absolute banger of an episode from start to finish, and it follows the 12 stages of the hero's journey pretty closely. It also gives a bit of a handy instruction manual for how to enjoy the show if you dislike the monarchy, since Millward himself maintains his political beliefs but also makes a human connection nonetheless. Anyway, we start out in the ordinary world, England. Charles has a call to adventure. He must go to Wales. He refuses the call. He absolutely does not want to go. He crosses the first threshold by meeting the mentor. Literally over the border in Wales, he meets with his tutor, Edward Millward. He faces tests, allies, and enemies. He can't make any friends. He's not well received. He has a dinner with the Aberystwyth faculty and fails to know anything about Welsh history. He goes to the inmost cave. He's invited to Millward's family dinner. There's intimate nationalism, there's no titles, and this is the heart of this special world for Charles. There, he has an ordeal. At this dinner, the impact of British rule strikes Charles, as does seeing a loving family, and he makes the connection between Welsh lack of self-determination and his own. His reward? He can now identify with how silenced the Welsh feel, and he feels empowered to rewrite his upcoming speech. The road back. As the Queen and the whole royal family come to Wales and Charles resumes royal duty, he's starting to leave the special world. The resurrection. At the climax of the episode, Charles is reborn through his investiture speech, standing up for both Wales and himself. And finally, the return with Elixir. Charles returns to England and confronts his mother, resuming his original place, but with a newfound independence and clarity. That's his Elixir. He also gets a big Richard II moment, just in case you weren't sure how he's feeling. It's so good, it's so cathartic. Millward and Charles' relationship is beautiful to watch, and in the glimpses of Millward's side of the narrative, it's apparent that he's a hero in his own right, just coming from the exact opposite perspective of Charles. So they took a rather unlikable young man and made him sympathetic. They made us root for him. They won us over just as Charles won Millward over. Charles has an outer problem. He's forced to get through 3 painful months and learn Welsh, and an inner problem. He's lonely and has no agency. And those two problems intersect perfectly as they connect Charles to Wales, both resisting the force of the monarchy. The hero's journey builds empathy really efficiently. And look, I'm not advocating for every story to look exactly the same or anything. Many times the best uses of the hero's journey are intentionally not using it or subverting it. But I think in this case it's used perfectly. And it's not the only instance of The Crown using the hero's journey to convey human story under historical events. In Season 2, Episode 4, Beryl, Margaret is sent on the journey of meeting people who don't care that she's a princess. Her ordinary world is represented by a stuffy fairy tale birthday photo shoot, and her elixir of individualism and sensuality is shown through her new love interest's photo of her, scandalous and powerful. Philip undergoes a spiritual journey in Moondust, Diana a public journey in Australia, and so on. Sometimes it's not the entire journey from start to finish, but slices spread throughout an entire season, or heightened pivotal moments like the crossing of the threshold or the meeting of the mentor. Which brings us to character tropes or archetypes. So we've looked at the hero's journey as a process of plot, but the hero as a character itself is the perfect example, and I think it's why the character of Elizabeth is decreasingly compelling as the show goes on. Not to say, well, she stops being interesting altogether, but I'd argue she's much less sympathetic in Season 5 than in earlier seasons. You might think that's the point, maybe it was intentional, maybe it's a statement on how the establishment squashes character. I think that's being a little generous though. Either way, looking back at Elizabeth in Season 1, if you're able to put aside whatever feelings feelings you might have about the monarchy and the real-life queen, this is a wonderful character. Because she has to ascend earlier than expected, she makes for a great reluctant hero. The reluctant hero is someone who, all things being equal, would rather not embark on their quest. It's often circumstance that drives this hero to action. We see that as children, Elizabeth and Margaret pitch that Margaret be heir rather than Elizabeth, who has no interest in it.
I don't want it.
But that's a no-go, and particularly in season 1, we see Elizabeth with greatness thrust upon her. It's hard not to be sympathetic to someone being stifled and used, and in this phase of the character, when she shuts someone down or seizes a moment, it feels cathartic, whereas later on it feels rather unpleasant. In the Herculean task of humanizing Margaret Thatcher, they again turn to character tropes with some strong effect. I mean, damn it, they had me feeling bad for her in that Balmoral test episode, using the familiar fish out of water piece. They also build her as a creator, someone who is motivated and hardworking, held in contrast with the seemingly frivolous royal family. But as with any writing tool, character tropes can go either way. They need artistic purpose, not just to be used as a lazy crutch. I'd argue that in the episode Favorites, when Margaret Thatcher's son goes missing, and she kind of loses it over the Falklands, that they've leaned too hard into the mother archetype, the dark side of which has the ferocity of love lead to emotionally driven anger. Even Thatcher's son kicks off the episode saying, quote, "All mothers care about their boys. It's hard for them to get past that maternal instinct, isn't it? They get emotional." Like, okay, we get it. And we know that this was an active decision because in reality, Thatcher's son was found and safe for several weeks before the Argentine scrap metal workers put up their own flag. I wasn't a fan of this move. It seemed out of character for even the purely fictional Thatcher, and leaning too hard in that direction was, if anything, dehumanizing in my opinion. But those are just a few examples. We've also got Diana as the innocent, Winston Churchill as mentor or sage. When she's functioning as a supporting character, Margaret can be the jester, funny and insightful at once. When used well, these don't serve to diminish or reduce the characters, but rather the idea is that because they are notably recurring in the collective human experience, they establish familiarity and relatability when used as characterization guidelines. Again, used well, they're a smart tool for exaggerating real people into dramatic characters. So that takes us to self versus shadow, a common storytelling trope that examines duality within ourselves, usually the hero. And I have no doubt that the real queen did, or any real monarch does, feel sincere conflict between their public selves and their private selves. The Crown heightens that conflict to a running theme in the course of Elizabeth's early years. I think most often to Margaret, she says that she's acting as queen, not as sister. This is clear use of the divided self, a common storytelling technique. Whether it's Freud's id versus ego or Jung's persona versus self, characters are often embroiled in conflicts within their own being. That's not all that remarkable, it's a common feature of reality, of course, but where that conflict emerges as a distinct technique of storytelling is when alternate versions of one character aren't held within their own selves, but are rather personified externally through other characters. This is a common setup for heroes against villains. You know, Harry Potter and Voldemort are two sides of the same coin. So one way the Crown builds narratives is through this external representation. There are a few examples. Margaret and Tony each embody a piece of world buried in the other. Sometimes Elizabeth and Margaret are held in direct contrast, each wanting what the other has in a way that builds them into opposites, with opposite approaches to ruling and showing personality. But the clearest example is when Elizabeth meets Jackie Kennedy, who, even before they meet, is someone who makes Elizabeth feel territorial. There's a recognition of threat, particularly as Elizabeth sees everyone around her obsess over Jackie's arrival. They build this confrontation of self through visual symmetry with distinction. Elizabeth and Jackie both wear noteworthy blue dresses when they first meet, but where Elizabeth is adorned in heavy jewels, a brooch, gloves, heavy accessories, Jackie is smooth and bare. They bond over shyness, comfort with animals, and outgoing, vivacious sisters, and they seem to have reconciled nicely until Elizabeth hears that Jackie has badmouthed her out in public. Knowing that Jackie achieved a diplomatic win for America and France, Elizabeth flies to Ghana on a controversially bold diplomatic outreach to Kwame Nkrumah. Elizabeth returns to confront her shadow self again, having lunch with Jackie and taking a win as Jackie is humbled.
And perhaps the worst thing in this episode and this scene is the scone, very dry scone, probably produced the day before, dare I even say it, perhaps even shop bought by Netflix.
But then minutes later in the episode, JFK has been assassinated and Elizabeth sees Jackie on TV still marked with her husband's blood. Elizabeth insists that the palace observe a full week of mourning, and that, going dramatically against custom, the bells at Westminster Abbey be rung for an hour to mark the death. The episode ends as she starts a letter, "Dear Mrs. Kennedy." So why? Why did she care so much? She barely spoke to JFK. It's obviously not about him. It's not even really about Jackie. It's about herself. She even says, as she and her mother watch the reporting of JFK's death together, quote, "That's the thing about unhappiness. All it takes is for something worse to come along to realize it was happiness all along." So they might have wanted to cover Nkrumah, maybe they felt they needed a post-colonial episode, maybe they really wanted the Kennedys to be involved, and to piece this all together into cohesive narrative, they put Elizabeth on this personal journey in confrontation with another version of herself. Putting genuine, true historical context aside, this is a pretty stunning episode of TV from start to finish, and it leans on well-established storytelling mechanisms to do so. The crux of Elizabeth's personal journey on this episode is that lunch with Jackie when she hears all about Jackie's mental health problems and her horrible relationship with JFK. In that conversation, Elizabeth can see part of herself in Jackie and realizes all along they had more in common than she thought, even though she does cut up her scone all wrong, which takes us to symbolism and metaphor. So, symbolism and metaphor are a trademark feature of The Crown. The Crown is pretty well known for its heavy-handed use of metaphor and visual storytelling, and I understand why people complain about it, but I think it mostly works to help distinguish this show as fiction and to create a romanticized version of life, to create a bit of a story world rather than replicating the literal world. In season 5, we've obviously got the royal yacht Britannia being retired. I'm pretty sure the Queen openly says it's a metaphor.
Even the televisions are metaphors in this place.
When Philip and Elizabeth's marriage is in trouble on royal tour, the seas are stormy. There's often a loud clock ticking in moments when Diana is alone. Everyone's marriages are in trouble in season 5, and Windsor Castle catches literal fire. Diana is likened to a hunted, wounded deer throughout the Balmoral test, and most repeated are the montages of people getting dressed with heavy emotional music playing. Actually, these moments are so frequent that I think they slow the entire show down a bit, but they're making a key thematic point. As Philip says in season 2, they're all wearing costumes, putting on a show, creating public personas. This is a defining feature of The Crown, and it works to convey meaning onto historical moments and add to the characters' stories. I mean, it's the damn basis of the show. Almost every episode refers to the family being a system, the monarch being a symbol. Even the show's intro has nothing to do with politics or maps or people at all. It focuses on the one thing binding all those items together, the crown. It's also, the name of the show. My personal favorite use of symbolism in the entire show is actually a sneeze.
Bless you. Sorry.
It's in season 3, episode 7, Moondust, which is my personal favorite episode, focusing on Philip's midlife existential crisis in conjunction with the 1969 moon landing. I fucking love this episode. I could talk about it forever. It's funny, it's meaningful, it's deeply human. I never thought I'd feel remotely connected to the husband of the Queen of England, and yet it really does not matter that it's Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, leading this episode. He's simply a character purveying the human story of existential disappointment, of personal dissatisfaction, of life not matching your idea of life. In a private audience with the astronauts, he's hoping for philosophical amazement, and just as they're getting settled in, they're all sniffling and sneezing, and that's fine, it's a little off-putting, that's fine though, but then Philip tries to steer the conversation towards real significance, and he's bizarrely interrupted with a sneeze. And you can read on Tobias Menzies' face just how much that yanking down from ideals to reality pains his character in the moment. In reality, Neil Armstrong did apparently cough in the Queen's face, and in reality, I'm sure it was an awkward or weird moment, but there's nothing emotionally significant to 3 men having a cold. It's just a thing that happens. But here, it's an absolutely exemplary moment of The Crown, taking something surface level from reality and creating a story that's sort of truer to humanity and more impactful to us than seeing a shot-by-shot replication of the technically true event would have been. Philip says that watching the moon landing was like watching a dream, that he expected them to be giants, gods, and in reality they were just 3 little men sneezing with colds. The sneeze doesn't do this alone, of course, the dialogue carries things along, but the sneeze utterly disrupts and shatters the dream that Philip has built around these 3 men. And you kinda can't help but wonder what it would have been like to meet the royal family and see them sneeze. You know, these grand holders of myth and wonder wrenched back down into their very human bodies. And then the astronauts themselves are symbolic, of course. Their lack of emotion or depth, says Elizabeth, makes them best suited for the job they have, says Elizabeth. See what they're doing there. The moon as well. The moon that for most of the episode represents everything inspiring and courageous and meaningful to Philip, but as he realizes, once you get there, without faith, it's just a hollow nothing. It's just dust. And so, despite mocking all the religious men, the episode ends with Philip rediscovering the power of faith. And look, you don't have to be remotely religious to understand that his earlier obsession with action, with fitness, exercise, achievements of the body, is a manifestation of his misplaced care for all things internal. He even says that going to talk to Dean Woods at the end of the episode was more frightening to him than going up in a rocket would have been. The show approaches symbolism with so much artistic intention that it even uses historical moments as symbols themselves, relaying broader theme under the overarching umbrella narrative of the monarchy. The highest rated episode ever, Season 3, Episode 3, Aberfan, is a 1-hour story about a horrific tragedy in the Welsh mining village of Aberfan that killed 144 people, mostly young schoolchildren, and how this accident was perceived emotionally and politically. The episode does right, I believe, in its depiction of the affected families, but also uses the moment to represent something greater. Death and exploitation at the hands of profit, the muted suffering of the working class. We also have a personal human story. Elizabeth has been trained her entire life to hide emotion as much as possible, and suddenly it's expected that she show some publicly, which takes this episode further into the realm of symbolism, exploring the theme of ceremonial leadership. Harold Wilson details how he uses symbols of the working class to make himself approachable when he'd actually prefer drinking brandy to beer, and suggesting to us, the audience, that leaders are symbols themselves. It's not exactly groundbreaking stuff, but it's still a good scene. So we have a few layers of awareness here. The show isn't remotely subtle about using symbolism itself, but it also has characters discuss the idea of symbolism, how being reduced to a symbol diminishes the self.
We can't be everything to everyone and still be true to ourselves.
But then it goes ahead and uses both intense historical moments and characters as symbolic. Peter Townsend was a real person, of course, and important to the real Margaret, but in the show he's used as a symbolic representation of the kind of happiness Margaret might have had in a different life. His role as a supporting character is to catalyze resentment and loneliness in Margaret. Porchy is somewhat similar for Elizabeth, as is Scotland for the Queen Mother in Season 1. So I don't know if it was intentional or not, but there's certainly a piece of irony in how they depict people faltering under the weight of their symbolic roles, but also use those very people to make symbolic points as characters. And to recognize reality for just a second, here's where the empathetic characterization of these people might become a problem. The show suggests this idea that being symbolic to so many people diminishes the agency and personhood of these individuals, and the implication there is that they have no power, which is a handy means of avoiding accountability when it comes to the years and years of trauma caused by Britain, including under Queen Elizabeth II's rule. But the truth is we don't know. We don't know to what extent the members of the royal family have political, moral compasses or ever try to act on them, and at least this portrayal gives the audience some latitude for interpretation. But when it comes to symbolism, yeah, it's a little heavy-handed. It can be a little annoying. I think they leaned too far into it with Season 5, using just about every inch of setting to remind us that the Queen is older than she used to be, by 1 year. But that takes us to Season 5 and what went wrong. So the point I've been trying to make is that most of the show's exaggerations from reality aren't for fun shock effect or pure sensationalism, rather they're intentional constructions of well-established narrative art. That doesn't mean it's always perfect, doesn't even mean it's necessarily a good show, but it does explain what the point of giving us this period of history was, to tell human stories. But looking at Season 5, so first of all, Peter Morgan has previously said that the most fascinating part of creating The Crown was going back and discovering pockets of history that aren't particularly well known, digging around to bring interesting narratives to light. You'd think, given that the only glimpses beyond family drama are a very rushed over and narratively meaningless Hong Kong return to Chinese rule, the 1918 murders of the Romanov family, and the 1946 backstory of Mohammed Fayed, you'd think that the period of 1991 to 1997 was devoid of any major events. But geez, we are missing so much. In December 93, we had the Downing Street Declaration, which aims to allow Northern Ireland to have more of a political say. In 95, Jerry Adams shook hands with Bill Clinton in a controversial meeting. In 91, South Africa repealed apartheid. The USSR broke up. In 93, the European Union really began. In 94, the Rwandan genocide. In 92, the Bosnian genocide. I mean, the season ends in 97, and I will be somewhat appalled if next season doesn't begin with the 98 Good Friday Agreement, but based on the minimal historical reach of season 5, I won't be surprised if it's just fully ignored. And this new precedent is certainly disappointing when it comes to historical truth and the justice of being seen and heard, but also from a storytelling lens, it's a total break in setup, and in my opinion, makes for a far less interesting season. Secondly, the character focus is confused. The Queen is hardly a character this season, with only 1 or 2 flashes of human emotion. Largely, I can't root for her anymore. I don't feel particularly sad for the Queen saying goodbye to her giant water mansion after she's sounded ridiculous, saying it's not a luxury and taxpayers should fund it. And that's fine, that's a more realistic effect, I'm sure, but it is a break in presentation from seasons prior. And actually, the flattening of major characters is a running problem in season 5. This third iteration of Philip lacks the humor and wit of earlier renditions, and I don't know if it's intentional or not, but he also breaks from the wonderful continuation of Matt Smith to Tobias Menzies. When Menzies replaced Matt Smith, he carried forth Matt Smith's version of Philip's demeanor, the way he carries his weight, his comedic timing, and background acting. Menzies' Philip is more settled in his personal life, but he's existentially unfulfilled, and you can really see it built off of what Matt Smith established. I think that's largely lost here. There's no snark or real vision to this character anymore. Likewise, Josh O'Connor as Charles in seasons 3 and 4 built up this snobby, yet battered, lost, sort of wretched soul with glimpses of kindness and care that was so nuanced you could hate him and want to see him happy all at once. And I just think Dominic West was a big whoopsie daisies in this casting. Yeah, he's too handsome, but Josh O'Connor is quite handsome too. And Josh was able to bend and stoop and scowl and carry words in his mouth in a way that embodied another being. And again, I think that's lost here. Actually, despite his scheming and sort of villain-esque monologues, the whole season feels somewhat like a love letter to Charles. I don't know what royalists were worried about here. If anything, he and Camilla seem more reasonable and more violated than Diana, who by the end of the season, I think came across a little bit entitled and self-focused. And that's fine, it's good to build nuance to the character or other sides of the character, but there wasn't enough of her victimhood or seeing her try to do good, seeing her being a real mother. I think they were relying on us already having a great deal of sympathy and care for Diana. And yeah, Elizabeth Debicki is absolutely outstanding. She becomes Diana herself, but also continues with the posture and mannerisms of Emma Corrin, adding a maturity and darkness to the innocence and purity to great effect. She's an absolute highlight of the season. The character of Margaret, meanwhile, is given one standout episode with Peter Townsend, which I do think was of the caliber of previous seasons, and did a wonderful job of connecting past to present. But beyond that one episode, Margaret otherwise might as well not be there at all. Likewise with Anne and Andrew, and even the Queen Mother, who honestly, since after season 2 has been a bit of a bummer. But with season 5, I'm just frustrated with this narrative shift. One thematic undertone of the first 4 seasons was, as we've said, the crown. It was the establishment of monarchy on the shoulders of one woman, navigating politics and duty while reconciling her inner self with her outer persona. Now it's that she's old. But namely, the problem is that The Crown doesn't seem to have anything to say about Charles and Diana that hasn't already been said, either by the tabloids or other of many adaptations. The show is still beautifully produced, and the quality of the scenes minute by minute is fine, but it sort of seems like the show was just waiting in line to do their iteration of the divorce story, but in doing so, it just hops from one iconic tabloid moment to the next. All wonderfully created, so the shot of Diana in the revenge dress looks perfect, but seems to be just ticking off a box. Showing us Diana's interview by intercutting it with scenes of the Queen celebrating her anniversary and slow music doesn't make this repetition of the past into art. Season 5 almost explores the question of the monarchy's relevance in the modern world, but it does so mostly through the lens of Elizabeth as a fixture of antiquity compared to Charles as a force of modernization. Personally, I think that's a bizarre choice, particularly given that when real Charles is formally crowned next year, he'll be nearly a decade older than Elizabeth at the start of this season. There are also tons of people all across the world and in England who dislike the monarchy but loved Elizabeth herself. But that's just my opinion. I think even more objectively speaking, season 5 failed to really get into the question. In earlier seasons, the monarchy's relevance to regular people was explored in 2 episodes that focused on journalism, season 3 Bubbakins, and season 2 Marionettes, and it was weaved throughout other episodes such as season 4 Fagin and season 2 Beryl. The theme gives the show some meaning. Wherever you land on the answer of the monarchy's relevance, it's certainly a question worth asking. At the show's best, watching an episode, you can ask, okay, why did they tell this one? And the answer isn't just, well, they had to eventually, or well, the audience was expecting it. When season 3 of The Crown came out, I didn't think, oh boy, they better give us the moon landing. They chose to because they saw a story there. Philip technically did meet the astronauts, but they created a phenomenal human narrative out of it for us. In contrast, think about that moment with the revenge dress. It serves next to no narrative purpose for the season. It looks great, it looks so incredibly exactly like the real Diana in 1994, but remembering that this show is fiction, did it really do anything? I understand that it was a bit of a fuck you to Charles and Camilla, but if I didn't know that already from knowing reality, I don't think I would have gotten that from the show. And even if I had, so what? Why does that matter here? What does it do? Quite apart from a speech in Welsh or a fake tear in Aberfan or Philip meeting astronauts, it doesn't carry anything powerfully human, and neither does this season as a whole. Overall, if you're watching for the core characters, Elizabeth, Philip, and Margaret, I'd say seasons 1 and 2 remain the best. If you're watching for essence of story, season 3 I think has the best stretch of episodes. If you're watching for sexy drama, you'll love season 4, and if you're watching to make yourself fall asleep, then enjoy season 5. Now, it obviously had its moments, and maybe it was exactly what you were hoping for this time period. The closer it gets to the 21st century, the more exciting it gets because we know what to look out for within the family itself. I know I was excited to see the revenge dress, and I'm hoping to see St. Andrews next season, so I get the fun in that, but leaning the show into that direction does come with a cost. I have a clear sense of why we're here for the first 4 seasons. I understand why they make the decisions they do, and even if I don't appreciate or approve of some of the bends from reality, they all make perfect narrative sense. My interpretation of seasons 1 through 3, to a lesser extent 4, is that they don't use storytelling for the royal family, but rather use the royal family for storytelling. Honestly, the biggest downside to strong storytelling is that it builds undue empathy for people who exist in real life and probably aren't as thoughtful or compassionate as they're shown here. And the question of why is this show here matters. We've had countless reiterations of Windsor family drama, of Churchill, of the British monarchy. It's a viewpoint of history that not only prevails as the dominant one in archives, but is also privileged as a cultural fixation. So when yet another royal drama comes forward, it better have something new to say. And the upside of sweeping through decades of history like this show does is that Elizabeth and Philip start to feel like walking collections of stories themselves. Something that I think, again, was lost in season 5. So look, during season 4, somewhat, but particularly in the run-up to season 5, all of these voices came out against the show, saying that its sensationalized representation of history will do an injustice to the living monarchs, that it's unfair to cast this family in a certain light. And I mean, that's what Shakespeare did too. But I hear that, I really do. The way in which fiction contributes to and shapes our collective memory and understanding of political figures absolutely matters. But I have to ask, where were these voices? Where was Dame Judi Dench, these devout defenders of truth, when the Crown condensed the Troubles into botched montages that conflated time and perspective? Where were they when post-colonial Pan-Africanism was just a minor stop on the road of Elizabeth's inner development? Where were they when Kwame Nkrumah's political ambitions were quelled by the foxtrot? And to be clear, my frustration is with people like Judi Dench who have huge platforms. People all across the world have made excellent criticisms of what the show chooses to include and how it does so. I've linked a handful in the description, along with a recent John Oliver episode on the monarchy, which is definitely worth watching. I'm not saying that the intimate stories and trauma of the royal family members themselves should not be treated with respect. But that respect for truth is often so selectively geared towards them underscores the actual problem here, and it buries the more important issue, which is really whether or not the show should exist at all. As one critic, Sohail Sarkar, put it, the Crown has firmly placed itself as yet another vehicle of Britain's colonial amnesia, blissfully neglectful of the collective traumas of post-colonial nations. And it's eminently true that significant stretches of ongoing history have once again taken a narrative backseat to rich people problems in this show. But personally, I think that the caliber of storytelling in most episodes of seasons 1 through 4 justify its existence. The Crown isn't so much about these people, but about the stories they can carry to us as characters because of how many fascinating events they've lived through, although the selection and portrayal of those events is undoubtedly flawed. I enjoyed most of the show, and I think it did accomplish some good. You'll see in the description articles that are glad The Crown exists because it does bring some stories to light. And the core characters are flawed. This is by no means a pretty portrait 24/7. There's space for ambiguity, and in that sense, the storytelling does achieve a piece of realism. But because I value fiction so much, because I think the line between plain entertainment and art is drawn partially by how these works reflect and subsequently impact reality, I think as we await for season 6, we can and should expect better.
Oh, dig that crazy rhythm.
Oh, no. There is perhaps nothing more pathetic than the world's most famous adult song saying, dig that crazy rhythm, with what I can only describe as big narc energy.
The age of deference is over.
And what is left without deference?
Equality.